I'm very, very focused on workforce development and opportunity. And I have been since I first was elected. I've been in my 6th year as representing the 2nd Congressional District in Congress. And in the beginning, we were talking about jobs, jobs, jobs in the economy, and we were going out and putting together job fairs. And then I started talking and visiting companies. I've visited at least 50 or so companies in this Congress at your company, and I get a tour and find out all about it. And it started to shift more as the unemployment dropped, more toward we're having a hard time finding the employees with the skills that we need. And it can be in manufacturing that's become more and more sophisticated around this region, the advanced manufacturing. Over in Keene, over in Nashua, we have microelectronics and the coding and IT and all. But it can be literally anything. Auto mechanics. We were just having someone talking about auto mechanics, and that's totally computerized. So in any event, there has been a shift toward not just looking for any old employees, but looking for employees that either have the skills for these 21st century jobs or have the aptitude to learn those skills. So I just came from a roundtable discussion. You have tremendous resources in Keene and the Med-Onondaga region, and so it's always fun to bring people together. We were visiting your career and technical education program at the Keene High School, so they were the hosts. And then we had with us the River Valley Community College, Keene State, Hannah Grimes Center was there, the Chamber of Commerce was there. Bensonwood was part of the panel, but we had probably a dozen or so other employers from across the region. And then the fun part was we had 3 of the students from the Career and Technical Education program. And we just talked for an hour and a half, nitty-gritty conversation about what I'm looking for is how can I be of help? How can the federal government play a role? What are the gaps? Is it funding? Is it programming? And it turns out it's a little bit of everything, but part of it is awareness. And so I was excited that to help get the word out about what the possibilities are. And I'll just walk you through it very briefly. The students started out talking about 2 of them in manufacturing, one in fire science and EMT. So, which that was a fun part of that conversation is that whole first responder role is really evolving. Fewer and fewer fires, which is a good thing. More and more social safety net, healthcare, the opioid epidemic. He's very excited. And these kids from Keene High School are doing internships in the community. So he's riding 60 hours with the Keene EMTs. And he's very excited about the education he's getting. And then the 2 guys doing manufacturing, there's a big generational gap about machinists. And it turns out that we've told a whole generation of students, we've talked about college, go to college, go to college. And young people over that period of time stop making things and doing things with their hand and taking shop and becoming machinists. And so when I go around to manufacturing companies, there's a serious gap. Machinists are very highly valued and they're retiring at record rates. If I talk to big employers, General Electric and lots of manufacturing plants, this is a top concern of theirs. And Press Tech was there for a local company that was concerned about this. So these guys are becoming machinists. One of them in the less mechanized and more learning the craft, lathe, and all different things that he's learning to do, with sort of fine technique, and then the other getting into the advanced manufacturing side, the CNC machines and the computerized, so he's learning the programming. But I mean, it was fantastic. These are high school kids. They're graduating from Keene High School in June. And they're going to be very valuable. And they're also doing internships in companies here in the Keene area. And then, so we went from there to the 2-year community college. And there's a really great program, sort of an articulation agreement from the high schools to the community college that's called Project Running Start. So these students in the high school are getting actual community college credits. I think they told they could get up to 9 or 11 credits while living at home for essentially for free. It's a $150 fee, and if they can't afford to pay it, the Charitable Foundation has some scholarships. So for example, the young man talking about the fire safety, if he waited till after graduation and went to the community college in Laconia where he could get that credential, it would cost him $4,000. And he wouldn't be living at home. He would, have to borrow the money and go get a place to live. And so then we talked about the programming that's available in the community college. And I'm very, very excited about this. We have brought in federal funding, for example, over in Nashua for advanced manufacturing, and then this new program called microelectronics. But there are lots of different examples here in Keene and Claremont, and we now have a new campus for River Valley Community College up in Lebanon. And then we went from there to Keene State, and they have an articulation agreement that people can take the 2-year degree and move over to the university system and get credit. And so it's all about making this job training and workforce development more accessible, more affordable for hardworking Granite State families.
So
we've
we've done,
excited.
yeah, we've done a whole bunch of reporting on this over the last
Yes,
months.
yes, and in fact, you're getting involved as a company in this.
Yeah. And so I've had the chance to travel around the state to see what other municipalities and towns are doing to meet this crisis head on. And everybody seems to be touting a bunch of small victories,
Yes.
baby steps.
Yep.
But at the same time, realizing that this is still a crisis situation. So to your view, is the state doing enough that's proportional in terms of a response to the magnitude of the problem?
It's
And
interesting
can we
when you
live with
ask
small
the
victories?
state,
Yeah.
because if you're asking with a big S, I would say no.
Yeah.
What I think is happening that's very typical for New Hampshire is corporations and not-for-profit organizations are stepping up. So, for example, your role, but also just last week I met with Tom Raffio chairs a group that has been set up from the New Hampshire Community College and University Council, so all of the colleges, with the business community. And they've created, it was a big committee that I was meeting with. I think there may be 50 people in the room on this committee, from companies all over the state and educators all over the state, to really drill down what do we need to do here. And part of that conversation then carried over to today. One piece of this that is bigger than the little individual victories is talking about thinking of the solution in a different way than people have thought about it in the past. The head of your Chamber of Commerce, Phil, had a great, he brought up a really interesting point. He was talking about the supply and demand side of this, and he said, employers can do more to have a pulling of, in other words, to attract workers. And he cited in particular, we talked a lot about Badger, we talked about Bensonwood. Bensonwood was represented today. Companies that, Hypertherm up in Lebanon is an example. Companies that invest in their workforce through workforce training, through family-friendly work policies, respect and appreciation and value of the employee. And it can be anything, you know. I say it can be this generation, this young generation that I get to work with every day is fantastic. Very innovative, entrepreneurial, very bright, talented. And what they care about is the mission of the work. They want to know that the work has value. They don't, in our generation, if you were miserable at work, that's what you did for 8 hours, and then you went home and had a life. And they're saying, no, we're going to turn this around. We want to actually care about the work that we do. We want to be treated with respect and dignity. So the whole issue that we're dealing with nationally and personally, sexual harassment or bias in the workplace or not being welcoming and accepting of people with disabilities. So that then led us into a whole conversation of who's available to do the work in New Hampshire. You know, we wring our hands over the aging demographic, but you could also look at that and say we have a lot of wisdom, we have a lot of experience, and meeting them where they are. This doesn't work for everybody, but for some employers, thinking of things seasonally, where people in their 60s with lots of talent want to aim toward retirement, maybe want to live in a warmer climate in the winter, but they're available for 8 months and they're bored and they want to get back to work. And or we talked about the new Americans, and actually there was a great example here from your continuing education. She had some really good examples of office skills and training for refugees and immigrants, and that's an even bigger issue over in Nashua and Manchester and Concord. Huge new population of refugees and immigrants in the state. We talked about veterans. I serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and I've got legislation to translate the talents of veterans into civilian credentials. You know, people that have been overseas working in field hospitals that have fantastic credentials under adverse circumstances, lots of experience, come home and they can't get the most basic job, even at the VA hospital, because they don't have the right credential. So you want to be a physician assistant, you've got to go back to work, at school for 2 years. And they say, well, I can't afford that. I've got to raise my family. So we've got legislation to translate that credential and make a preference for hiring in the VA, because lo and behold, it turns out the VA is short on physician assistants. So there, and we talked about this last week about credentialing and barriers to entry for a lot of these refugees and immigrants have skills in their home country that haven't been translated here. Sometimes literally translated and sometimes just the skill set. So we talked about seniors, new Americans, veterans. Then we talked about there was a wonderful guy there who was talking about the people in recovery, people who have had a brush with the criminal justice system and they can't get work. Maybe we need to start to look at that differently and start to say, look, you're in recovery, you're turning your life around, we'll support you, we'll get you back to work. A quarter of the unemployed men, adult men, are out of the workforce because of the opioid epidemic. And so how do we turn that around and get people into treatment and back to work, taking care of their families and filling these jobs? So it was, and then I talked about women coming back into the workforce. One of the women I met at the microelectronics boot camp in Nashua, she was actually an immigrant from Mexico, had been in Nashua 16 years, was a citizen. Her company that she was working in moved the jobs overseas to Mexico, and she said, I'm from Nashua, I want to stay here. And she was doing this microelectronics boot camp, and so that she could go back to work, and she's going to raise her wages dramatically. I mean, these people are coming out of some of these programs, advanced manufacturing or microelectronics, they're going straight into jobs that are $55,000. You know, if you have two people with that kind of income, 6 figures, you're going to do well in New Hampshire. You can own a home and raise a family and have a nice life.
There is a component to the workforce development challenge that relates to New Hampshire, I believe, being the leading exporter of higher education students.
Right.
And so
yes.
did that come up in your discussion? And more specifically, what would be a federal role in addressing that issue?
Yes,
It's
and
easy
I'm
enough to
so
say the
glad.
state should do something.
There was so much in an hour and a half, and I'm glad you brought me to that. We had a fantastic conversation about internships and apprenticeships and programming that gave people work experience during their schooling. And specifically, we talked about that very issue. New Hampshire has fantastic higher education. We've got a very strong community college system, a very strong public university system, and then a dozen or maybe 24 fantastic private schools that are doing well and provide a great education, from Dartmouth and St. A's and Franklin Pierce, Southern New Hampshire University, one of the fastest growing schools in the country. And what we talked about is that people come here and love their undergraduate experience, but then they assume they have to leave to find the kind of work that they're looking for. And there's a serious disconnect. And this can be federal programming to encourage and provide funding for apprenticeships and internships. But it doesn't even have to be funding. Like after a fellow came up to me and had all these great ideas, and he said, it's not even really funding. It's getting the word out so that, and I think this is where the internships come in. And the funniest part of the whole thing, there was, NHPR was taping the whole thing, a lovely young woman, I interviewed her with her afterward. Come to find out, she is a Keene State student currently who is interning at NHPR. She was going to go back and cut the interview and send it to them and go back to class. And where does she want to work? She wants to work here. She wants to stay here. So I think collectively, and this is where this Stay Work Play New Hampshire, or if you did it in Monadnock, you've got great resources with Keene State, with Antioch, with Franklin Pierce, with Claremont and River Valley, and figure out a way to connect up internships, work experiences. And we've done it in our office, and it's the best source because we get to check them out, they get to check us out. We hired a young man, Bobby Graham, who was the president of his class at Keene State College, and we met him when I came over to do events here and invited him to come to an internship, and he's been fantastic. And so I think part of it is making ourselves kindly welcome as a region. We have an expression we use in our workplace about radical hospitality because we're in the service business. And I talk to these young people when we're going out, when we're meeting people, when people are asking for our help. And I think as a region, as a state, we need to, but it's more like a marketing campaign. You know, it's more like that sign down in Boston, if you lived here, you'd be home by now. You know, catching tens of thousands of people come up the highway every weekend to go skiing, to go to the lakes, to be in the wilderness, to be in the outdoors. Catching them on the way back saying, we have thousands of fantastic jobs here right now as we speak that you can make good pay, your housing might cost less than it would in the city, we've got a nice quality of life. But that, I think, when you asked originally about the state, I think the state could be doing more. We have fantastic programs for hospitality and letting people know that the Granite State is a great place to come for vacation. I fly in and out of Manchester every week, back and forth, and we have these big posters about, you know, come spend your vacation here. Well, what about big posters that have pictures of these incredible companies that I've had a chance to see? Most people don't I didn't know they were there. Most people would not know they were there. How would they know that these companies, Mirage and Prestec and Hitchner, and they're internationally renowned for what they do. And Bensonwood, what a fantastic company. Badger, for us to help get the word out, because your point about people who have come here for school, they know the life here and they like this area. And what the conversation I was having with one of the fellows from CNS is that if you hire people from away, as we used to say, they'll come for a year or two, they might like it, but then their family draws them back, or then they say, oh, I'd rather be in the city. And we used to have this problem in the law firm in Concord, where I worked for 25 years. But if you bring people on who are here and show them the opportunities that are available without moving, I think you have a much greater likelihood. And what he was saying is for every year that they stay, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, you have a much better chance of holding on to them. If you find a spouse here, if you start a family here, you're going to stay. So it's a challenge, but totally doable. And I'm looking at ways that I can help, and the federal government can have a lever with this incentive or that program. I've got legislation about incentives for businesses to work with educational programs on skills improvement, and I wish that it had been included in the tax bill. I think we could have done more in the tax bill to incentivize on this issue. But I'm also saying that part of what I was learning from the discussion today is that it doesn't always have to be federal funding or a federal program.
So you touched on, as part of that topic, another crisis. We're full of crises here, which is the opioid issue,
Yeah.
which hits New Hampshire particularly hard. And you fought for more and targeted funding,
Yes.
federal funding for the state. What is, from your perspective, holding that back from happening? Is it a tight-fistedness at the federal level, or is it an ideological thing? Why is that money not coming?
It's a great question, and let me just I think it's a leadership gap from the White House right now, from the president, and I'll be very specific about it. Let me step back to say that we've come a long way on education and attitude. I'm very proud of my role creating and now chairing the bipartisan task force to end the heroin epidemic is how we started it. Now we call it just the opioid task force. We have 100 members of Congress working together. That is highly unusual. 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans coming together, meeting on a regular basis. And the step one, I would say, has been accomplished, which was to educate my colleagues with the education that I've gotten over the last 4 years that started right here in Keene. My first public meeting was in Keene with a group of families, and the first aha moment was learning about the teacher from Keene High School who had died, and everybody couldn't believe it. How did that happen here? Since then, I have worked nonstop on this, and what I've done is bring people from around the country, experts and people in the field, from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, talking about the disease of substance use disorder, people from Dartmouth Medical School came down, we have had law enforcement, we've met with the DEA, just a whole range, taking on the full complexity of this. Health insurers, pharmaceutical companies, trying to understand. I learned a great deal from an incredible book called Dreamland. I don't know if you've seen it, but I highly recommend it.
It's a good book.
That describes how this happened, what it was, this perfect storm that led us to this point. And then I've talked to everybody I could that has some solution on how do we turn the corner, how do we get our way out of it. Last week I spent the whole week visiting programs in right here in New Hampshire that are starting to pull us out of this. And what I would say in terms of attitudes that you mentioned in my colleagues, we have educated them and expanded their perception of this so that they understand it's a disease. They understand that we won't arrest our way out of this. They understand that we need greater access to treatment and what some of the barriers are for that, including workforce development. They understand the importance of education and prevention and long-term recovery, that it's not a one-and-done 28-day, that the rate of relapse is high. They understand the burden on families and communities. And more and more and more so, they are now living it. This is, just step back, we launched our new agenda 2 or 3 weeks ago. And 4 different people, members of Congress, spoke and in their remarks mentioned either a close relative or a very close friend who was dealing with this. One, his friend died literally the week before. In my case, it's been since I've been involved in this issue. I have a brother on the West Coast that's gotten caught up in this. Another friend of mine, her sister died from this. So members of Congress are living this now, the way their constituents and their communities are. The second part you asked, what's the barrier? So we know what needs to happen, and literally on the way over here, I approved a press release about a bipartisan approach on funding. The problem is at the very top, and I'm just going to be blunt. I am disappointed with the president for his lack of leadership, despite what he learned when he came here during the New Hampshire primary and the talk for the first year of his presidency. He talks about it a lot. He finally, at our request, did issue the emergency, public health emergency 90 days ago. Nothing happened. And so we asked him to reissue it. He reissued it last week. He didn't mention funding in the State of the Union. He didn't mention increasing access to treatment or any of these initiatives that I'm talking about. And it gets worse. He still has not appointed the what we call the drug czar position. It's the Office of ONDCP, Office of National Drug Control Policy. Still not, he hasn't even made the nomination, to say nothing of filling the position. And it gets even way worse. Last week they've announced that they're going to cut that ONDCP budget by 95%. They're going to eliminate the office in the White House that coordinates drug policy. So that is a lack of leadership. And what we're asking, and this letter will go to our colleagues in the House and the Senate, is to appropriate the funds so that communities all across this country can tackle this. This is an emergency. People are dying every day in communities all across this country. And we need to take steps. And so we need funding. We had passed, 2 years ago, we passed 14 bills, and we got $1 billion of funding at the very end of the Obama administration. I actually went to the bill signing in December, and that was the last bill he signed. What we need now is that same commitment. And we need funding for the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act. We need funding for the Cures program. We need funding at Health and Human Services and at National Institutes of Health and at the CDC, because we've got to do the research to get ahead of this. We've got to get upstream. Now we know, the CDC came out with a research last March, that the longer you're on the opioid medication, the higher the rate of addiction. Dramatically so. If you take opioids for 1 day, 5% of people will still be on that medication a year later. If you take opioids for 30 days, over 30% of the people will still be on that medication a year later. So now what we have is states starting to institute 7-day and 10-day limits on the medication, with an exception for chronic pain, cancer, hospice. I've introduced that legislation with my Republican colleague, Dr. Rowe from Tennessee, that's also been hit very hard. And I expect that we'll start to see dramatic results.
Are you getting much resonance out of House leadership on these issues?
Yes, here's the irony. We do have the support of House leadership, and it's on both sides of the aisle. So my leader has had this on her list of negotiation for every time I talk to her. She brought me to a press conference last week when the government, trying to reopen the government after the shutdown. So I know it's on our list, high on our list for domestic non-defense spending. And then I was very pleased to hear that Kevin McCarthy mentioned it on his list as well. So I think it is part of the negotiation, but it needs leadership. And if the president's going to talk about it, he should be talking about how we fund it. I don't think he should get the credit for talking about it without recognizing that communities need the resources to fight this battle.
So legislation is part of it in terms of setting rules for prescribing opioids and painkillers and such. And you mentioned needing funding for a variety of programs and departments. And I've seen the figure 25 billion.
That's the figure that Senator Shaheen and Senator Hassan are using.
Yeah.
I think all told it will be more than that. And
Okay.
what they're referring to is this emergency fund.
Right.
He designated the emergency, and there's zero money in that fund. So they're saying for the emergency response, 25 billion. And then there will be other parts in other parts of the budget, in research, in law enforcement, that type of thing.
Right. But so in terms of money that wouldn't be appropriated specifically to departments as part of the normal course of budgeting, say that 25 billion in emergency funding, if that were passed, what would be the immediate use for that? What would be the first thing you'd say, okay, this is what needs to get funded with that money?
Sure. Well, if you're talking about New Hampshire, part of our perfect storm that puts us at the top, and look, I'm proud of being first in the nation for our presidential primary. I don't want to be first in the nation or second or third for deaths from opioids or fentanyl. So part of our perfect storm is that we have double the national rate of opioid prescribing, and we are next to dead last for access to treatment. So we need to tackle this from both ends. And the meetings that I've been having with last week, Dartmouth Hitchcock, talking with Anthem. Anthem has a fantastic new program, and they're going to start to institute changes in their protocols with their pharmacy. Dartmouth has a new protocol coming out with their pharmacy. So nobody knows why we have double the rate of the national average for prescribing, but we need to tackle that immediately. And then we have a long way to go to provide access to treatment. And this is why it got so bad here. You can't get treatment in New Hampshire. It doesn't exist. We went from 1,000 beds in the 1980s. Every hospital had 10 or a dozen psych beds. There were private agencies. You had lots of them in Cheshire County. You had 60 beds here, 100 beds there, private agencies doing drug and alcohol treatment. And guess what? People say New Hampshire is frugal. Sometimes New Hampshire is just cheap. We did not reimburse for treatment. And this is Republican governors and Democratic governors. It did not. And so slowly, bit by bit, all through the 90s, all through the early 2000s, they closed their doors. They could not make ends meet on the reimbursement levels. And hospitals across the state closed their psych beds, and private agencies closed their doors. Now we're down from 1,000 beds to somewhere 250 in that range. So we've got a long way to go. So one of the things that the government can do is to help with the seed money to reopen or to open new agencies. And I'm working all over my district. I'll give you an example, and this is why it's hard to pinpoint where the money is, but in Bethlehem, New Hampshire, there was virtually impossible to get treatment north of Concord. Bethlehem, New Hampshire, we are doubling the capacity of a treatment agency there. It's called Friendship House. We got funding from, of all places, the U.S. Department of Agriculture Rural Development Funding, because during the Obama administration, they recognized that this is a uniquely rural crisis, and that came out in that book. And so we helped to get the funding from that and something called the Northern Borders Council. And we're working with a nonprofit group out of Littleton that does housing and other projects to put this together. And hopefully we'll be able to open, in the next year or so. I think it's going to be 32 beds or in that range. We've got funding in Franklin for something called Farnham North. Farnham is a program out of Manchester that's very successful and very good. We worked with Alex Ray from the Common Man Restaurants to start a program in Franklin, and that's been very successful. So, and it's both inpatient and intensive outpatient, so it doesn't all have to be beds. For many people, the beds, that's the first 28 days, and then they need a longer-term recovery. I'll tell you a very exciting program was a visit to Anthem last week, a program called, ARC. What was the name of it? Aware.
Aware Recovery Center.
Thank you very much. That's the ARC, Aware Recovery Center. And this one is incredible. This I had never heard of. Intensive outpatient care. Intensive home-based care. I'm sorry. So it is outpatient, very intensive, a year long. The first quarter is visiting frequently with a psychiatrist, if you're on medically assisted treatment, getting that squared away, meeting in groups, meeting with a personal therapist, having a social worker assigned to your family, meeting with family groups to deal with your dynamics. And then they stick with you, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter, fewer visits, but coming to your home, making sure that you're keeping to your recovery, that you're getting to your meetings, that you're seeing your therapist, helping you with transportation, or helping you literally change the patterns of your life. If alcohol is your drug of choice and you used to hang out in a bar, helping you to join a volleyball team and go to yoga. If drugs were your problem and you had a group of people you used to shoot up with, getting you into a class at the community tech school and meeting new people. It was fantastic. And I was meeting the very first people that were coming out of that program. And Anthem is all in on this. $38,000, and it's cheaper and better and more successful than anything else they could be doing.
You talked about the lack of leadership when it came to the opioid crisis. The president made a big statement about the veterans, about how he was going to make sure that every single veteran medically was taken care of. How do you think he's doing on that promise?
I'll give him a little bit more credit there, but primarily because of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, who I think has had some success. Because I don't think the president has played much of a role, but this happens to be of his cabinet, the one person that I have some confidence in. Although I will say in the next breath that we're struggling with some serious, serious problems at Manchester VA that are getting potentially worse before they get better. We now have the focus of the secretary. He came up and we had some, Shulkin is his name, we had some really good meetings, and we have a task force in place, but we needed all new leadership. And we need really a top to bottom, bottom to top shakedown of the whole institution. Horrendous things were happening. Medical malpractice was happening. And still, one of the people that was committing medical malpractice and putting patients at risk, we recently found out has been moved and is practicing medicine in another state in the VA. Mm-hmm. That person should lose their license here. They shouldn't be practicing medicine anywhere, to say nothing of in the VA. So this has been a big priority for me. I serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee. It's a tremendous honor for me. And I'm very focused on getting access to high quality care for our veterans. They deserve it. And in White River Junction, they get very good care. And Keene, many of them are very happy with the quality of the care.
Very high with the care.
Yes, exactly. That's a wonderful program.
Once again, it calls for money.
Yes, exactly. And this is, and I worry about this. Let me tell you what's going on with the Republican approach from the administration and from my colleagues on our committee. There's a group, it's called the Concerned Veterans of America, and they're actually funded. I think this is traced back to the Koch brothers and this whole outside influence. Their goal is privatization. They do not want the government to be providing the health care to our veterans through the VA. Now, I want to say my position is nuanced in the sense that I do support choice in the community. If you cannot get access to the quality of care that you need, and this is part of the problem in Manchester, it's one of only 3 states in the country that does not have, New Hampshire that does not have a full service VA hospital. Right. So what we were working on in Manchester was to have surgery sent out. Say, for example, they had a very good contract with Concord Hospital. Concord was pleased to be doing it. The veterans were pleased with the quality of the work. But there are certain services for veterans, and particularly with regard to mental health and to war-related injuries, combat injuries, where they are uniquely situated to provide the quality of care that veterans need in the VA. And I am very nervous that this push to move services outside into the community is really a disguise for a Republican agenda to privatize the whole VA. Because what's going to happen going forward, first of all, you just don't print enough money for every veteran to go wherever they want to get whatever kind of care they need. I mean, that might be the way I would set it up if I had a magic wand, but that's not realistic. So what's going to happen is that the VA is going to be reimbursing these community providers. And then step by step, there's going to be more and more pressure in Congress to cut back and to shrink the VA to make up the difference. And you're going to start to see VA hospitals closing and clinics closing all over the country.
So what can be done
to
prevent this?
To me, what I believe needs to happen is we need to right-size this, find the balance where the VA does what they do best. They're the best in the world at traumatic brain injuries, for example, PTSD, some of the sort of cutting-edge research that's been done in the VA where they have that expertise. 40% of the workforce in the VA are veterans. So veterans like being treated by veterans. Let's support that, continue to invest in that as taxpayers. We support those who protected us. That's my goal. That's my mission. And then in situations where there is lack of access, either because they don't have the resources or they don't have the workforce or they can't provide the service, then consider contracting out into the private sector.
You've introduced a number of pieces of legislation that are aimed at combating sexual assault and
Yes.
sexual harassment. What more can and should Congress be doing to protect victims of sexual assault, sexual harassment in the workplace especially?
Sure, thank you for bringing it up. I appreciate it. Two parts primarily. One is, quite simply, we need to get our own house in order. And I don't think anyone in Congress that I know understood how bad the process was in Congress. It's just flat out offensive. It's a process that was designed to protect members of Congress, and it was not responsive. We got a letter from 1,500 former employees telling us to change this, and it gave us the opportunity to look at it and say this is outrageous. That the victim who comes forward, has the courage to come forward, was sent to counseling and forced to wait a 30-day cooling off period. So that'll give you some sense of what this looked like. So I'm very pleased to announce that we have bipartisan legislation. I'm a proud co-sponsor of that. I participated in the hearings and in the drafting of that. And I anticipate that we will pass that relatively quickly. And we'll send it to the Senate, and I know Senator Shaheen and Senator Hassan are working with their colleagues, and I think that we'll be able to get this done relatively smoothly and quickly, I would expect, and I would certainly hope. Number two, we can train, you have to go beyond the processes and procedures to the changing the attitudes that got us into this situation. And I will say, certainly from my experience working there 40 years ago when I was sexually assaulted as a 23-year-old, that Congress has a long way to go to improve. And it just never occurred to me that in the course of 40 years it wouldn't change. I did not anticipate that. So now we know, time's up, and we are going to provide training. And two things about this. One is I want to give Speaker Ryan credit where credit is due. He's now made that training mandatory for all members of Congress and for all staff. So we're talking thousands of people. And number two, I am leading the charge on making that training much more effective. And by that I mean right now our training is just on the internet, online, and it's sterile and not very effective. And what we just rolled out in our office with a group of members of Congress and staff just a couple of weeks ago is an interactive type of training that's being used in the Air Force that's called Green Dot, and it really is empowering everyone to be part of the solution. When you think about it, virtually all people, most people want this to stop. They want people to be respected in the workplace and feel safe in the workplace. But we all have barriers to why we don't step up, why we don't speak up, why we don't say something. And so this is a training that gives you the tools not to overcome your barriers, but to recognize that you have barriers and to give you alternative techniques for changing up the environment in the workplace. And I'm very excited about it. Our staff really appreciated it. And I'm now working with my colleagues there's going to be a request for proposal, and we're going to initiate this training across the board. So that's getting our house in order. But I think once that happens, we will be uniquely situated to share that with the American people, with employers and all over the country, and with community groups that are involved in this, to spread the word about that. because what I liked about this training is we all need to participate. You know, I say to my young staff all the time, I remember ashtrays in restaurants, and I remember smoking on airplanes. And I remember the HIV/AIDS scare where people couldn't get hired if they were gay, and we were all afraid. And I remember car accidents before seatbelts when people died. And the truth is that our country is very good at big societal changes, particularly that type of public health changes, if we all work together and have a good approach and work toward a goal. My goal is to eliminate sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace, in the military, in schools, in our communities. So the second piece is that I've launched and again founded and co-chair a bipartisan task force to end sexual violence. We set a lofty goal. Enough is enough. And part of that is legislation, and we have a whole group of areas that we're tackling: K through 12, higher education, the military, educating law enforcement, cyber bullying. But it also is drawing attention. It also is participating in what has become a much bigger conversation from this #MeToo moment that I believe is becoming a movement. A moment implies a short period of time and it will be over. I think this will take a longer period of time, and we're not going away till we're done. And so, for example, at the State of the Union, I helped to lead an initiative where virtually all of my colleagues, men and women in the end, wore black to sort of in solidarity with survivors and to say enough is enough. We had the Time's Up pins. My guest for the State of the Union is an incredibly courageous young woman named Chessie Prout, who was the survivor of the rape, sexual assault at St. Paul's School. She's coming out with a book in March that's just going to be extraordinary, and we're going to bring her back. She's already spoken to our task force, but we're going to bring her back and other survivors. And we are going to continue to keep this discussion in the news, in our communities, in our schools, in the military. I'm going up to West Point to talk to them about their progress. And we're not going to go away till the problem goes away.
What else do you think can be done sort of on a national scale?
Sure. Some of it has to do with laws. So, for example, cyberbullying is a really significant problem. And we don't have the laws in place. We don't have the definitions. We don't have the resources within the Department of Justice to prosecute the crimes. Local communities don't have the resources to prosecute the crimes. And by that I mean both the money and literally the skill set to know how to recognize it and what to do about it. And so there are very specific things that we can do for, say, Title IX and higher education. And again, this is a difference of opinion for me and this administration. I think that the steps that they're taking are weakening protections and the safety and security of women and some men on college campuses, and I'm very concerned about that. So that's something that we'll watch closely that we can change. Certainly in the military and for veterans, some of the most tragic testimony I've had to sit through was were veterans and members of the military coming forward to our committee talking about what had happened to them. Interestingly enough, it's an equal number of men and women because the number of men, the denominator is so much bigger for men in the military. Horrifying stories. People called down by their superior officer to come to a particular place, and you have to obey the command, and then locked into a closet and abused by multiple people. So we need to provide resources for treatment and recovery. I mean, there's so many parallels, oddly enough, with the opioids. You need education, prevention to try to get ahead of it, and then you need treatment and recovery to try to cope with the aftermath, and then you deal with law enforcement to try to have consequences.
And it all's under leadership, midterms.
Yes.
Are you running?
Yes, thank you very much for asking. I am, thank you. I should have said that at the beginning, you wouldn't have had to listen to me.
We're the first to
That's
know.
why,
Are you the first to know? No.
Have you made it?
Yes.
Have you made the announcement that you're running? Have you?
Yes.
When did you announce it?
I haven't had any great fanfare around it, but yes, I've been going all over the district, meeting with people and on a very regular basis. So it really never stops, to be
Now,
honest.
What about the interference? What do you think? Midterms, the election, all the stuff that's going on
Yeah.
with the Russians. Now, how do you think that's going to play out?
It's frightening. Frightening for our democracy. I don't mean that personally as a candidate, but I will tell you a quick story. This whole drama about release the memo, and I do have an opinion on that. I agree with the Department of Justice and the FBI that I have grave concerns. I do not think we should release the memo, and we can talk about it. But last week during the shutdown, my colleagues and I all started to notice, because we stay in close touch with our staff, the phones were ringing off the hook on this release the memo. And my colleagues and I are all like, well, the government is completely shut down. Aren't they calling about that? And they said, oh yeah, we got, 12 calls about that, half saying that's great, half saying please get it open. And then we got 64 calls, release the memo. And we're like, what's the memo? Like, what are they even talking about? Come to find out, CNN confirmed this week, it's a Russian bot that's telling everybody to call your member of Congress to release the memo. Thousands of phone calls. And it's hard to get people motivated to call their member of Congress. I've tried. It's a lot of work. But can you imagine that? That's going on.
Has the intelligence
Pushed it.
community verified that?
CNN had it. It was like lost in the news. There was so much going on. I saw a glimmer of this, and then I believe that they were quoting the intelligence community confirming that. But I can get that for you. But I mean, that's how easy it would be. So yes, I am very concerned.
What can be done? What can be done?
I think one of the things that can be done is really working with our American companies, because Facebook and Twitter are just now, I saw a headline literally this morning, increasing the number of people that were exposed to the Russian interference. It's in the millions of people that fell for these ads, and they have those records. And if they know now, I'm guessing they knew then precisely where those ads were coming from and who was placing them. So I think that we need to, I'm all for freedom of speech, but our democracy is at stake here. And I think we need to sit down with these companies and say, how are we going to approach the next election? And how are those decisions going to be made? That's number one. Number two is educating the American people so that they are aware, just as you educate teenagers, don't believe everything you read, getting out a story like the Russian bots and this release the memos so that people understand the influence. And then during the course of the election, hopefully journalism writ large learned a lesson from getting all in the weeds on Hillary Clinton's emails and I can remember literally reading John Podesta's recipes. It's like, come on, something much bigger is at stake, and for national journalists covering elections to be able to step back and say, where is that information coming from? Is it credible? So. And then protecting, and we did this during the Obama administration. Actually, it was a huge effort, because remember, the scare was that the local election systems would break down. That there were, and that must have been coming from the FBI so there was a major initiative for training and protection of the equipment to make sure that the election was protected and viable. We obviously have got to continue that, and I want to make sure that this administration will be on board to that. Because I think part of what's happening, and it's a real breakdown, by the way, in the House Intelligence Committee, and I'm very, very concerned about it. And part of the reason it's happening is that the Mueller investigation is getting closer and closer to the inner circle. Mr. Flynn and Mr. Manafort and others that presumably have that the Mueller investigation now have some of those people in their confidence and are learning whatever these back channels were about Russian interference in the election. And all the way down to and including the most recent charge that is quite extraordinary, that there's a possibility of a Russian agent on the campaign. So it's more important than ever that we get to the bottom and get to the truth of this. And what is happening by my colleague, Mr. Nunes, is a partisan attempt to discredit the Mueller investigation. And as one of the best headlines I saw was that the Saturday Night Massacre is happening in front of all of us. In slow motion, in broad daylight, we are watching it happen. And the only good headline I saw, because I was checking all day today, because I assumed that the memo might be released before I got here, the last headline as I'm getting out of the car is that the current director of the FBI, Mr. Wray, I think you say Ray, W-R-E-Y, that he would resign if the memo was released.
The latest thing I got was that the president is going to authorize its release.
That's what they're saying,
Right.
tomorrow.
Right.
But then they're saying Mr. Wray would resign if
he
it is
does.
released. And I think then it's incumbent upon the media and elected officials to inform the American people that this is a constitutional crisis and that for partisan means. And you can tell, there's always a tell, right? And the tell in this one is that the committee voted to release the Republican memo, but would not allow the release of the Democratic response. That's a partisan approach. And just to give you a little bit of background of why I'm so concerned about this, it's not the content of the memo that the reason why I don't want it released, because that would be a partisan approach on my part. What I want to say is that it is the method. The House and Senate Intelligence Committees were created in response to Watergate, which I remember very, very well. I was young, I was in high school, but I watched it like a hawk. It was a seminal moment in my lifetime, and I'm sure for all of you going into journalism. The response, the responsible response, was to say we are going to create committees in the House and the Senate to create oversight for our intelligence gathering, FBI, CIA, DIA, etc. But the rules of the road, and it was a very important, you could almost say fragile, but critically important agreement by all the parties, was that members of Congress would handle highly classified information appropriately. And by that I mean secretly, keeping it secret. I have colleagues, I have friends. We watched the football game, the Patriots game, with a friend of mine on the House Intelligence Committee. And we're always trying to get information out of them. What's going on now? They won't say a word. They can't. If you watch them on television, watch my colleague sometime, Adam Schiff, and how careful he is. He's on television all the time. He's trying to keep the American people informed that the investigation is continuing and that they can have confidence in it. But he will never talk about the content of the classified information. And here's why. It's critically important to understand. What they call the sources and methods, and what they mean by that are the people, the resources, the human resources, individual people, Americans around this globe that are in the business on behalf of the American people to keep us safe. They are in the business of gathering this intelligence information from other human sources who, for whatever motivation, maybe they're on payroll, maybe they've developed a relationship. These are human beings that are gathering this at great risk. And the way it works is that their identities are preserved and protected all the way up the chain. And that's what classified means. I've seen, we can go down to something called a SCIF and read some of this classified material. I can't talk about it, I can't say anything about it when I come out. But I've seen, they'll give an identity. They won't say the name, they'll say this person, provided this and said this, here's the quote. And one of the things that they do to try to refine the quality of the intelligence and the reliability of the intelligence is that they will compare across the different sources. So FBI, CIA, Defense Intelligence, cables through the State Department, cables through the Pentagon. And when you read an analysis in the House Intelligence Committee, at the bottom of every analysis, they will give you the reliability. And it's almost like you're on a scale, all right? And I can't remember precisely the terms that they use, but the point being, if all of these sources agree, you will get a highly reliable disclaimer on it saying, and if some disagree, then it will be less reliable because the DIA and the CIA have a different interpretation. That is at the heart of what's wrong with this memo. First of all, it was not read by my colleague, Mr. Nunes, the chair of the committee. He did not read the underlying intelligence. His committee staff wrote what I understand to be a highly prejudicial partisan memo that he signed off on. It does not fulfill the reliability. The information they used, they cherry-picked and used selectively without comparing it. And it gets worse. After it was voted out of committee on a partisan vote by the Republican majority, we learned last night from Mr. Schiff that they changed it before they sent it to the White House. Right. They didn't even send the one that was voted on. And they won't allow the Democratic response to be released at all. So that's my concern.
So we're going to have to, we have to
I wonder if I could just delve a little bit into some of the partisanship that you've been referring to, but bringing it back more locally. So in the last election you were successful, but at the same time, at least on a statewide basis, it was a pretty close race between now President Trump and Hillary Clinton. So that means, to me at least, a significant portion of the people you represent are supporters of President Trump. So how
fewer and fewer.
Well, how do you know that, and how are you trying to understand the
Sure.
people who supported him? And,
Absolutely.
And how do you represent them?
Absolutely, and I represent everyone. So I represent them because I meet with them on a regular basis. They come into our office and we help them get their veterans checks and their Social Security checks. I invite them to our forums. I have no idea. The people that I was just with, I know Not a single one. Who they voted for, nor does it matter, because we all care about workforce development. So today was probably uncharacteristic because the opioid issue makes me so upset at the president that he talks about it and doesn't fund it. I rarely, almost never use his name and rarely take a direct attack, despite my own personal views and disappointments in this administration. Because I think it's important that I represent all. Having said that, it's very clear to me from as much time I spend in the communities that the frustration with this administration, and frankly with his personal behavior, his erratic behavior, the tweeting, that I meet people all the time, who told me that they voted for him and they're disappointed in his performance in the first year. So I think that is very common. And look, this is a midterm. He's not on the ballot. It's incumbent upon me to make the case as to the work that I'm doing on behalf of everyone in my district. And you can tell from the issues that we've talked about that I'm very, very bipartisan. My other colleagues, my friends, have not gone out and put together a bipartisan task force with 100 people on opioids, but that's not a partisan issue. And I say to my colleagues all the time, the heroin doesn't choose R's and D's, and we can't either. Likewise with the sexual assault, that was last April that we started that task force, well before the Me Too moment or anything else, because I think it's important, and I reached across the aisle to colleagues that are Republican, that are male in this case, to say, would you start this with me? I know you were a prosecutor, and I know you worked in prosecuting these crimes. So there's so much work that we do. It doesn't get the headlines, but it's a catch-22. It doesn't get the headlines because it's bipartisan, because we agree. And so I try to make a decision every time. Veterans is not partisan. I'm actually very fortunate that I serve on the two least partisan committees in the whole Congress, the Agriculture Committee and the Veterans Committee. So I said from the beginning, I'm kind of uniquely situated. I was raised Republican, and I have a lot of views about workforce development and entrepreneurship and innovation that are not unlike the views that I was raised with in a Republican family. And yet the Republican Party has really changed in my lifetime, and I feel so strongly about civil rights, personal individual rights, women's rights, look where they are in LGBT or so there's so many issues that I could never find a home there anymore. Pro-choice, it's ironic. I look at the choice issue. I was raised in a Republican household, less government interference in people's personal lives. To me, that's a pro-choice position. So, I try to find common ground, bring people together, and at the same time I have very strong beliefs and values about inclusion and making sure that and that was what was so hard the other night watching that speech. It was not an inclusive speech. It was not about unity. It was not about bringing people together. It was about dog whistle words and wedge issues to drive us apart. Even on immigration, we have bipartisan colleagues coming together on immigration. Kelly Ayotte and Jean Shaheen voted for comprehensive immigration reform 5 years ago. And I would have voted for that bill the very next day, and we never had a single hearing in the House. And what did he do? Come and, throw gasoline on the flames. So that's the challenge, and I try to represent everyone, and I'll make my case between now and the fall that I'm in it to represent everyone, and I'm in it to bring people together to find solutions. Probably a good place to stop. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for taking the time. I really